We've taken a few weeks leave, and in between that time, so much has happened. We've had 2 general elections in the Caribbean, back to back virtually, and in both cases, the incumbents will return to office. I think in one case, however, in the case of Guyana, the PPP, civic, has entrenched itself in the parliament with a wider margin. They've got a new opposition, and it's going to be interesting to see whether that opposition grows and stays the course, because I think it was somewhat of an accidental entry into the politics for Azruddin Mohammed.
Yes.
And then, yes, would you agree with that, Tony?
Yes. And also, Holness barely made it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the PNP, People's National Party, they doubled their position from, I think, 14 seats. I think the last I saw is 29.
Yeah. It was surprising to me because I think Holness has done a good job, and but success always breeds contempt, so it would seem. And we'll see what plays out there.
Yeah, but the polls were actually fancying at the end the PNP, so it got in by a squeaker based on the poll. So anyway, let me just introduce the panel here today. I have 2 Tonys with me, both Anthony Paul, who is in studio here. Anthony Paul is the chairman of the Lloyd Best Institute, which of course is where we broadcast from. And he's also here, however, as a geologist, but with an emphasis on the energy sector. And because of his significant contribution to public discussion on local content and how developing countries in particular can maximize the value added from their gas in particular, well, oil and gas. And that carries him up and down across the Atlantic, and he has just come back from Africa, I think, and probably on his way to Africa again, because, I mean, there's a constant traipsing around the world in that regard. And joining us from Florida, am I right, Tony? Tony is
Yes.
Anthony Bryan. And Anthony Bryan is always co-opted when it comes to matters of international relations and geopolitics in the Caribbean. I think you also have your own organization, your own think tank.
The Caribbean Policy Consortium, APC.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a collection of people who have an interest in the Caribbean internationally. We have members from all over the world, actually. And we tend to work on energy-related matters quite a bit. At least I do. And, energy in Guyana, energy in the Caribbean, energy in Latin America. But there are also people who write on politics and geopolitics. For example, Ivlo Griffith is a member of the CPC. David Lewis is a member of the CPC. Scott MacDonald, some really good people. And from Trinidad, of course, the Lorraine Sobers, who Tony would know, is very much involved as well.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's good to know that, because that sounds to me like another resource that we could somehow tap into from time to time.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And of course, I am Sunity Maharaj from Caribbean Newsroom. And the matter that brings us here today is the military buildup in the international waters beyond the Caribbean Sea, or maybe in the Caribbean Sea, in the international waters, they say. That seems to be escalating with the U.S., with Venezuela in the crosshairs of the United States. That matter is an object or a subject of great speculation. Venezuela is dominating the world's headlines. Most of what I have read from American analysts in particular seem to think that this is a matter of regime change, even if the U.S. authority, the Trump administration is saying it is here for to deal with narco trafficking. And in that regard, it escalated the situation a couple of days ago when it just destroyed a vessel that it said was carrying cocaine, drugs. It was carrying drugs. Some 65 miles of some location that was not stated. So we really don't know what 65 miles means, whose waters it would have been in. There's been also, most people would know, the assignment of a fleet of fighter jets that are now based in Puerto Rico, and amphibious vessels, and so on and so forth. So those elements, given the fact that there has been a previous, I think, 2 attempts to unseat Nicolas Maduro as the president of Venezuela, suggest to many people that this is no intimidation tactic or any of the kinds of really high-profile, sensational things that Trump has been doing in the sphere of tariffs, where people are always wondering, is this a bluff? Trump always chickens out the whole taco. It doesn't seem to be what people are expecting with Venezuela. Tony, Bryan, what's your take on this?
I think it's a lot of shadow boxing by the United States. And the root of this, of course, is energy. It always is a matter of oil as far as Venezuela is concerned. So the United States is able to use the pretext of drug running and drug trafficking to justify any action it may take, as it does in the present time. But I say it's shadow boxing because there is no possibility of regime change in Venezuela without the approval of the Venezuelan people. It's as simple as that. And the military in Venezuela, it's a very strong military, as you know. I mean, they have some of the best armed forces in Latin America. And it won't be an easy thing to overthrow the government of Maduro unless the military in Venezuela itself decides to do that. So I use the term shadow boxing advisedly.
So when you say that it can't happen without the Venezuelan military, what role do you see the military playing? Are you imagining, for example, there's a lot of non-human attack through drones and so on. So when you talk about the Venezuelan military, how do you see if there is say an attack on some location that Maduro is identified as being? Do you not think it's still possible that it doesn't matter if the military is on board or not?
Yes, if they wish to use drones and targeted assassination, that is an option that the United States has. It does that all over the world, actually. But that would introduce an element of conflict, interstate conflict, that I don't think even Latin American governments would stand for. It would be seen to be outright combat, outright conflict. And I think we must tread cautiously when we think of what they can do as to what they should do or what they cannot do. It's a twisted environment.
Well, I only raise those things because of how many unthinkable things are occurring in global geopolitics right now, and we look at what Israel did with Qatar, even the attack on the vessel in the region was, the consensus appears to be that that was not a legal action.
There are no rules of the game anymore. You may as well throw away the old books with international relations and international law. It's a free for all in a way in which we have not seen, at least in this century. And I think every day has an end. Maybe states will come to their senses at some time. Maybe Netanyahu will be dragged before the International Criminal Court at some time. One could keep one's fingers crossed. He's committed atrocities in Gaza. And so I think that a lot of this stuff has to be played out in conflict situation all over the world. But with respect to our region, I don't think it's one that's about to explode by any means.
Paul, I think I'll call you Paul and Bryan. Actually, you both have surnames that could pass for first names, eh? So that might work. But you are really very close to the whole. You have hands. You have your pulse in it. You have your hand in it. And I should mention that he's now on the board of Heritage Petroleum, one of the state-owned entities, and therefore that consideration is part of your responsibility. What is the possible impact, if there is any implications at all for our energy sector? I mean, that's part of the job now, eh?
No, I mean, the issue really is, as Tony is alluding, and the discussion so far, is how far can this escalate? And will it escalate into a state where there is actually danger to people, to assets, the infrastructure, especially the oil and gas infrastructure? Now, I think Tony is right in that a lot of this has to do with oil and gas and access to Venezuelan crude. Everybody knows Venezuela is the most crude in the world, and that Venezuela is heavily sanctioned by the US. But the US still imports over 200,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan crude, in spite of the sanctions. And the reason for that is the United States depends heavily on mobility from fossil fuels, gasoline, diesel. And the American refinery complexes are mostly in the Gulf Coast and in the Midwest. And there have been no major new refineries built in the US since the 1970s. And those were built based on the crude that America then produced and imported, which was heavier than the crude they currently produce from the shale. So the shale oil is light and therefore and expensive to produce, and therefore won't give you the product mix, the gasoline and diesel that America needs at the price it wants. So it must be blended with heavier oil. And that used to come from Venezuela in a big way. When the first set of sanctions came onto Venezuela, that was replaced by crude from Russia. When the Russian sanction came on, then America had to make a choice. So you'd have noticed that recently, although an embargo was put on Chevron to not export crude, that was soon lifted. Because one of the biggest, most important indicators of the economic performance in the US is the price of gasoline. And to put shale oil into the refineries at over $50 a barrel, it really pushes up the price of gasoline. So the United States needs heavier crude. Venezuela is the closest source of large amounts of cheap crude for that. So the issue, therefore, is, one, is there a negotiation way out of this or not? And what we've seen is that there has been, from the day one of this Trump administration's government, there was a move towards negotiations. How that worked out or is working out, we don't know. But as we've seen in the recent past in other parts of the world, negotiations can end suddenly and turn dramatic.
When you say there was a move to negotiations, what are you referring to?
So when President Trump came into office, immediately sent a high-level diplomat to Caracas to talk about these things, which had not been the case under the Biden administration. There was very little contact. So
Yeah, which raises the question as to why you have this aggression right now. If a door had been open to negotiations, why are we seeing this show of force? I want to add, though, that there is a new dimension to the U.S. need for energy, and that is AI. The pace at which AI can develop but cannot develop is limited by energy and water. It needs copious amounts not available right now of energy because they're putting up these massive data centers. And in this race that the U.S. has with China, and China has a huge amount of solar power already that they're tapping into for this, there is pressure on the administration, I think, from the tech sector to ramp up the access to energy because they're seeing where it can go, but it's limited by those elements. So I don't know if that is a factor, but I put it in into the discussion that the Trump administration's investment in winning this technological war is maybe a factor in his decision to reopen coal mines and also make such an early push against Venezuela to either get it to comply in some way or to, well, I suppose in the extreme case, regime change. But what about, when you talk about negotiations, does Caricom feature in that, Tony, Bryan?
No, it should, but I think, from the point of view of the current administration in Trinidad, it seems to have disassociated itself from Caricom and speaking just as Trinidad and Tobago, which I think is a very poor diplomatic move. The negotiations that Tony was referring to, I think have to do with the fact that the administration in the US realizes that Venezuela is as the holy grail, if you will, of oil. And it will never, go to the extent to alienate Venezuela completely. It might take a turn of the Maduro administration. But in terms of Venezuela, the country, there is little evidence that they will want to abandon Venezuela or enter into poor relations with Venezuela. So it comes back to the question of energy, the question of oil, and you factored in AI, and I think, to be quite frank, the United States is losing the battle with China with respect to AI technology and all of the additives from it. They've lost the game, actually. And, China is supplying most of the software and hardware for AI all over the world.
But it's not a battle it's about to give up, though, is it? I mean, Americans still think that they have the lead on China. I mean, they say so publicly. And they are trying by all this denial of, certain kinds of chips and so on, which very perversely the Chinese leader has told his companies, you're not to buy any. We're not taking that favor from Trump. And they're taking a real firm stand, and go and figure it out, and they're working on their own sources, obviously. They've certainly tied up a lot of the supply of the rare minerals in Africa. And so their industries seem to, they're willing to go it alone, as they're choosing to do with tariffs as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Sorry, Tony, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Tony.
On the question of energy and power for AI, keep in mind that America is the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas now. About a lot of natural gas that can be used for power. They needed that. And of course, the light oil, the shale oil can also be used for power. They wanted to generate from that. So there's not a shortage of power in the U.S.
They are projecting, the figures, the industry is projecting needs a requirement that is so great.
So let me continue. So what is happening too is Texas, I think now, is probably pushing about 41% of its energy, something like that, from renewables. And California is increasing renewables. Not only that, recently Rolls-Royce just got orders to build small nuclear power plants for companies to drive AI. So there are other sources of power for AI that can be brought to bear if that would become a crunch issue. Just making that point.
Yeah, but you see, it is the issue of the race, because there are time requirements of what do you do, in what order, where is China, where is this one, where am I in relation to that, because it's about markets. Because the Chinese shocked the world when they came out with DeepSeek, right? The extent to which that was so much cheaper. Anyway, I don't want to distract the conversation from the situation now, but just put into it that we have to think what is behind this massive push for access to Venezuelan oil. But one of what the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the way in which she has come out very boldly, very loud, in other words, she has put up her hand for the Americans in this matter. But there was a previous opportunity that I think Caricom flubbed, and that is when Trump sent Marco on his mission into the Caribbean, because I was a little surprised that all the leaders there went into bilateral discussions and did not say that at that stage, Prime Minister Motley was the chairman and we will meet you as Caricom. And in fact, some prime ministers of the time were quite proud to say that we are going in for a bilateral. And they went to Kingston and they had their one-on-one meeting with him, apart from the Prime Minister of Jamaica, whom Rubio met in Jamaica House, the Prime Minister's office. Everybody else had to go to the U.S. Embassy and one by one have their meeting, right? And I thought that was a moment that CARICOM should have not entertained bilaterals, but should have had a united position in talking to Rubio.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I wouldn't say that CARICOM is falling apart, but I mean, you could judge from the position that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has taken that Trinidad and Tobago will go it alone. And there's not been any outburst from CARICOM to challenge that. And this is the tactic that the United States has always used. You isolate countries one by one, you deal with them bilaterally, and you get the best deal that you can from them. The hell was regional unity an obstacle.
Yeah. Well, we saw this with Grenada, when the ones who were in the corner of the Reagan, I think, was it Reagan? Bush? No, who was it at that time? Reagan. And we saw Tom Adams, Eugenia Charles, and somebody else was, they were in one corner. It was, I think, three of them. But I think the position of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has really put a spoke in CARICOM's wheel. They don't seem to know what his position to take, given how she has gone out there with that statement, with her statements. And so they have backpedaled and instead had a meeting of foreign ministers that did not put out a statement, but I think one of the foreign minister of Barbados gave an interview in which it was, well, we are all supportive of, any effort to curb drug trafficking, and I think they inserted as well and nobody has said this, publicly, that if you are in the Caribbean and you are looking after your interests in terms of drug running, what about the gun running that has turned the Caribbean into, a place of murder and mayhem right across the region? The most quiet little islands are now subject to gang warfare with heavy artillery and so on. And that there was no conversation in that discussion about, there doesn't seem to have been any conversation between the Americans and the Caribbean region about the terms on which you're entering the region, or doing something, engaging an idea with implications for all of us, in which we could have set what are the terms on which. And I think that is where they suggested that there could be that kind of conversation. But they don't know how to engage it, because I think she has tied up their hands, unless they're bold enough to assert a position.
Yes.
And you're not seeing that. While all of this is going on, we hear most of the reports coming out from the Secretariat and from the Prime Ministers is the conference in Africa, which is an important development in terms of our relationship for trade and culture. But there is an emergency home in your backyard. A potential emergency. And that is, it's like see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil, speak no evil. I don't know how, does it suggest to you that they're just going to wait and see?
It really begs the question, what is the role of the Caricom Secretariat? But if you think about it, this didn't happen overnight. There's a sense that things would escalate in the region. Now, and we all know that from what we've seen and read, President Trump is a negotiator. He looks at making deals. So, as you rightly say, we want something from that presence. Who prepared Caricom heads for this kind of negotiation? Should that be the Caricom Secretariat? Should they be doing this long-term thinking and planning and strategizing? Maybe they are. And if they did, how is that channeled into the discussions that individual prime ministers had among themselves and with the State Department or the president? So it really comes back to, we need to ask the question about the whole of Caricom, not just the Caricom heads, and see how that works in our interests. And I don't think we're asking those questions.
Well, I have been a critic of the Secretariat for decades. I remember doing a study together with my son on, the future of the Caricom integration movement, and we found it wanting, and in many, many ways. So I don't think as an institution we can depend on it unless there is really an effort for everybody to pull together. It doesn't have a common foreign policy, but we should aim towards something like that. It doesn't have a common energy policy, but perhaps we should move towards that. The leadership has to wake up. You get the CARICOM heads of government meeting, and a lot of pronouncements are made, and then everybody runs home and does their own thing, sometimes in contravention to what has been agreed. So it is faulty in that way. And, maybe some sort of re-engineering has to be done.
Well, there have been so many attempts. Remember that famous initiative that yielded the TOME, Time for Action? That was Sonny Ramphal. I think he was the chairman of that initiative. That was in the 90s.
Yes, I have several copies of it, actually.
It's a relic. Yeah, it has been reduced to a relic. And I think that is what allows the division and blatant division to occur. We do have, the CARICOM decision making doesn't supersede the decision of a parliament of a country. It's national sovereignty. In the case of the Trinidad position, that has not gone to parliament yet. But the Prime Minister says she speaks for most of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know how she quantifies that. It may be the number of voices that reach her. But why do you think she has stepped out so boldly? Anybody has a theory about that?
No,
I'm asked that question because there is also a diplomatic, more nuanced way, and her critics are saying, why didn't she not take a position that squares with our reality, that whatever happens, the U.S. will come and go, but we have to live with Guyana, with Venezuela, and we are in negotiations with Venezuela, just in the same way Trump wants access to Venezuela's oil and energy resources. We too want that, right? And but she did not choose that path, and it must be deliberate. And what is the thinking behind it?
well, I don't know whether she thinks she's an incarnation of Trump in the Caribbean, a Caribbean version. But I think what she has done is to depart from a foreign policy stance that Trinidad has had ever since Eric Williams' time. And that is a position of neutrality. A neutral country, friends of all, foes of none. She has departed from that. And I think that's really a tragedy.
But it must be based on some calculation that there's a benefited. I mean, you would of course get prominence. And, when you're Trump's friend, he will say the greatest things about you and you will get the attention. But can it be as simple as that?
No, I don't expect any gifts from Trump. I mean, I've lived in the Beltway. I've been a part of that Washington scene for at least 6 years of my professional life. I know how things work, and you can see the progress that he has made. He dispenses with people who can offer an alternative point of view. He just doubles down and barrels ahead with what he has to do. I see Kamala doing the same thing, just doubling down, not regretting, and delivering herself into the hands of Donald Trump and the Americans.
You mentioned the name of the tome that's the street that was
Time
called
for
Time
Action.
for Action. Mm-hmm. Is that what we're seeing though? Not just here, but in other parts of the world, where we've had generations of thoughtful leaders and lots of discussion and coordination of thinking and slow action. And you see a rise of people who are very focused, very deliberate in what they want to do and going after it. Now, where the politics land, we may not always agree with it, but they're moving on what they say.
So you're saying that it's changing political currents, and people are talking about a realignment of the world order, and in that, she's taking it upon herself to change that. What Bryan is saying.
So I'm saying, is it she or is it the political wins that are leading people into government position, winning elections? In that, what they promise are things people want to see done, and what they're doing is doing what they promised to do.
So that would feed into the view that it is not so much Trump, but that she is responding to her constituency, or the perception that for Trinidadians and Tobagonians, the priority is crime. And if he says it's narco trafficking, then we should embrace that and go, full Monty into that and say, yes, we support that.
Put it another way. Mm-hmm. So here's one line of action, full Monty, as opposed to the other lines of action we've been trying and not seeing the success. So maybe people are just desperate and saying, we want change. This is what it takes, let's go for it. And I'm not saying this is a Trinidad thing. I'm saying this in different parts of the world. It swings in popularity of some parties that were marginalized in the past. Suddenly become very popular. And why? Because they're targeting very specific issues, like immigration in some places, for instance, like culture in other places. So is that what we saw in the lead up to our elections. I mean, that was part of it. There were other issues, of course. Is that a wind of change around the world? Or is it just my limited view of the world?
Well, there's no dispute in the fact that crime is the number one issue for people in Trinidad. And it really doesn't matter what side of the fence you are. People want to be safe. They want to have a reliable life that they can count on and so on. In this case, you can either be skeptical of this whole argument of narco trafficking and say, and deal, as we have been dealing with it, that this is about energy, this is about oil and gas, American access to oil and gas, and we've kind of said that is showboating, the whole thing about, and there's a substantial thought on that, but one might buy into, one might say, yes, no, it is about narco trafficking, and in the same way, you have a state of emergency, and when that happens, you have a fall in the number of murders, and that is good enough. One might say, well, that's a state of emergency. You don't want to live as a people without your constitutional rights because they've been suspended, and you don't gauge the success under a state of emergency condition. You gauge the success when you restore people's rights and see if there's a plan in place that actually decreases murders, right? In this situation, the presence of the American Armada, as it were, in the seas around us, may have a deterrent impact on narco trafficking, but for only as long as it is there. What is the sustainable response? And we've seen in states of emergency that when they are lifted, the spike, people have the business and they're going to continue. If that's a multi-million dollar enterprise, billion-dollar enterprise, drug trafficking. And it's very much has to do with US and European demand. That's where the markets are. And so that's an American problem to be solved domestically. But I can't say there's nothing to indicate what the majority of the people of Trinidad think, because social media amplifies voices in a way that if you're following that, you will be certain, depending on where the algorithm takes you, you will be certain everybody around me take this view. And if the algorithm takes you somewhere else, you'll be certain. So the only place, and that is not the best place either, is to take it to Parliament. But when you have a constitutional majority, everybody can speak, but we know where the votes will go. And so you could have your position, but have it legitimized through the Parliament and say, well, yes, this is the position of Trinidad and Tobago, and the public has the benefit of the airing of the position of everyone to be more edified on the issues. Right? And I feel that the Prime Minister should have, this is a substantive issue. And while we do not wish to talk about, while we do not feel the worst case scenario is the likely scenario, I am always inclined to build from worst case, because you never want to be caught by surprise. You must have a plan for worst case. You say, as they say, do your best and hope. What is it? Do your best and hope for the rest. To do your best, but not be caught flat-footed, and to be very clinical about, in the worst case scenario, what precisely sending one Coast Guard vessel in Cedros is like sending, that's so small fry. Venezuela is well equipped as well. It doesn't have to even come close to us to say, let's deal with some of these assets that belong to the Americans. What are the implications for us is that if those things happen in terms of our economy, in terms of shipping, in terms of, but I am talking about worst case scenario, and you are both prepared to say, well, that's not going to happen. So there is no.
No, I didn't say that. I think you're right. To think about and prepare for the worst case. Because in the same way I talk about the winds of political thinking is changing, I think the winds of diplomacy is changing. And they're moving very quickly from diplomacy to crisis.
And people, the big powers, the world's major powers are every day doing the unthinkable.
That's exactly
and
where I was
getting
heading.
away with it.
Yeah.
because they are the powers, and they have they vote in the Security Council to block a lot of things. And America will tell you that they are not a member of the ICC. What international law are you talking about? They're not bound by it. What law? And that's your law. It's not theirs. So I think for me, the position of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is hasty, and it is grounded in a perception. And she is a lawyer. She's a prime minister. She knows the law of the sea. She knows international. She knows when people say, and we are a member of the United Nations. Right? All the Caricom countries are. And it required a more thoughtful response. And if Parliament had to be summoned, it should have been summoned before you take that position on behalf of a nation, of people, in a foreign policy matter. I know that Guyana was distracted with their election, but from the very beginning, when Venezuela started to act up and restate their claim to the Essequibo, 2/3 of Guyana, they were very clear that they were confident that they had the US backing, they had Canada, they had the EU, and that they were safe. And again, that was putting trust. And what is within? Where is the sense of sovereignty? Or is there no such thing as sovereignty anymore for small islands, small countries?
I think you hit the nail on the head there about the question of sovereignty. There just isn't any. And speaking in realpolitik terms, there just isn't any for small islands like us. One of the things that caught my attention was the Prime Minister saying that if Venezuela attacked Guyana, she would open the country, the Trinidad and Tobago, to US troops to combat that. Well, we have a forces agreement, an armed forces agreement, that in fact allows the US to come into Trinidad to do exactly that. We don't have to pass any special legislation or anything like that. That forces agreement.
That's a SOFA agreement. But isn't there also, but I am not sure about this, so I would ask your guidance, that when the Americans left Chaguaramas, that there were elements of that agreement, the 99-year agreement, that stayed in force. Right? And that those were security issues that if they needed, that was already in the agreement, and those things were not removed.
Wallafield, Chaguaramas, Carlson Field, all of those things come under that thing. And the SOFA just simply reinforces it. Okay? Those leases haven't expired. So it's not a question of inviting the US. The US will come in, legally in cases like that. So I don't know. I'm caught between a rock and a hard place, really. Whether the Prime Minister's statements are simply that, it's a done deal, the US can do what it wants with Trinidad and Tobago, and we have simply given up our position of neutrality in foreign affairs. If that's the case, well, that's the case.
But that's not the position, cannot be the position of one person, one leader, or even a government. That ought to be the position of a people. And this is why I'm saying that one does not stand up and say the majority of the people. You go to Parliament, you put the issues there. And as weighted as the Parliament might be in favor of the government, well, it's still the legitimacy of Parliament is required in these matters.
I agree with you, Sunity. I agree with you. And as I say, I'm having trouble deciding what exactly her position is. All right?
But do you find, Anthony, you live here, do you find there is unusual silence, though, of voices in this matter?
Yes, there's a lot of fear about speaking out. against some people and some things. So people are seeing repercussions from the social media posts, resulting in all kinds of actions against them, including things like visas being pulled and so on. People are very cautious in their public statements these days. A lot of people are.
And this is because of the administration, the Trump administration's policy. Tony,
Beyond that, even here in Trinidad, I saw it in the oil and gas sector. We saw all kinds of things happening that made no sense from a business side or countryside. But the people in the industry who knew about it never said a word publicly, because that is where they get their bread and butter. So they protect their self-interest ahead of the national interest. So those who know don't always say what they think publicly. But it's a small society. You haven't got many options for jobs in that way. And the people who hold power hold a lot of influence as well. So people do preserve themselves and their families by not saying what they feel publicly.
Well, that visa seems to be a powerful asset for many people. What is your take in terms of the Caribbean population in the U.S. at this time of deportations and immigration and ICE and so on? What is going on there?
Yeah, well, look, I spent the last 8 months in Trinidad. I only came back recently. And I have yet to gauge the mood here in the U.S. The people are afraid of ICE, okay? Because ICE is running around and seizing people at gas stations and restaurants and schools and things like that. So there's a sense of fear among members of the community, of the diaspora. And that will go on as long as Trump has a policy where they can pick you up on the street as was done in Nazi Germany in the 40s. So I see that fear. I didn't get the same sense of fear in Trinidad, actually, Tony. I found that Trinidadians went about their business jovially as usual. The people were enjoying themselves. I think it takes a lot more to scare us as a people.
But Trinidad is a multi-layered society, though. We have the capacity to enjoy ourselves. Don't ever forget these curfew parties in the height of an attempted coup, and while our parliament was were hostages. So you might find that, but are people stepping forward to say things publicly, because you have the government's voice is amplified. There's no hesitation for the prime minister to declare her position and for the members of her government to support that position and for her supporters to do the same. If there are people with a contrary view, are they coming forward?
I think so. I think some people who have been loud voices for social justice issues, who have been outspoken on the matter.
Have you heard the Chamber of Commerce?
Well, they are not social justice people, are they?
Well, with the Law Association?
Well, they too.
I mean, there's this issue of the legality of the actions. Have you heard them?
No, the professional associations in this country have been disappointing, really. Not only in this issue, but there are many issues about national development issues, about social issues. Do they have
the same problem that Caricom has, therefore, of being able to tackle things that may be divisive among their membership, and therefore let's not tackle that one? Is that what is happening?
And again, that might influence people's individual well-being. As lawyers, businesses, a lot of them depend a lot on government contracts.
I take a gauge on CNC3 News every night of, they ask the public, members of the public, what is their opinion about a certain thing. And I've always found that people are outspoken, they hold different points of view, and they're not afraid to say it. And I think that
but these are man in the street. Yeah. These are the man in the street. We're talking about institutional and vested interests.
No, institutions with vested interests, I won't go there.
Yeah. Did the
They each,
Energy Chamber issue a statement? I think did they issue something?
they each have their agendas.
Yeah, and Trinis are not never hesitant. You pick them up on the street.
Individuals.
You go to the street with your camera, and they will tell you. They won't. I suppose if some of them walk away, you wouldn't know because they wouldn't be on camera. They would not be carried. So I don't know. I'm not touching that. I'm gone. So that happens sometimes, but no, that you will get enough that will speak their minds, and they can do so in very colorful fashion. Yeah, yeah. So what if you were in the prime minister's position? Well, you don't even have to be in that, just in your own position. And you think that this is not really going to escalate. What do you think the timeline is for a diffusing of this? And what might cause that? Is there some do you suspect there is some negotiation going on outside of the public view with Maduro and the Americans? Do you think something like that is happening? Now, we also have, and I should just also put in the mix when I ask that question, the report of this Chinese hospital of, I think it's 300 and something beds, and a new vessel commissioned last year that it has dispatched to this part of the world, and I think it's going to Jamaica. It looks like one of these goodwill things. And is that coincidence? Do you think that's coincidence, or do you think China, which has already made a statement to the U.S. about any attempt to, I don't know if they use the word invade, but any attempt to attack Venezuela in some form, that should not be done. So they have declared their position in regard to Venezuela. And that the dispatching of this vessel, does it have anything, do you feel it has anything to do with that?
Well, I couldn't say so directly. What I will say is that the Chinese influence in the Caribbean is now very strong. Most governments in the region see China as an alternative to the United States and to Europe, and relations are pressing ahead. And the Chinese seem willing to involve themselves in just about everything in the health sector, in the highway construction sector in Jamaica, for example. So come on board. Do what you will. I will invite them.
What do you think is happening that
that
could determine the outcome of this moment?
Well, the Chinese have always had an interest in Venezuela. They need to do that. So anything that
but do they buy? Do they have contracts and so on?
They buy Venezuelan. They use their ships, and they find ways of paying through barter and so on. So
and there is no indication that the transport of fuel from Venezuela has been stopped in any way. I mean, the presence of the Americans on the outside of the region.
There's no indication of that yet. And you made the point earlier that we have to think about the worst case scenario. And those are some of the implications if there were a worst case that can happen. It can affect trade in crude, which could push up the prices, or move markets back more to Iran, for instance, to get more crude, those markets that now buy Venezuelan crude. And there's issues around the challenges we face about our own maritime sector, on which we are very dependent. We're dependent on movement of vessels to bring in product into the country or taking product out of the country. So we have a real issue if there's a disturbance of maritime trade.
But are you hearing any rumblings from within the energy sector in Trinidad?
No, the energy sector in Trinidad operates at two levels. The operations level on the ground, those are the oil fields and the pipelines. The strategic level, which is mostly run outside of Trinidad for the big players, whether it's the big multinational owned plants in Point Lisas or the ones operating big gas fields up to the East Coast. In Trinidad, the assets that would be affected locally by locally owned and controlled assets would be the oil fields in the Gulf of Paria, for instance, which are run by Heritage, or the infrastructure that NGC operates, some of the plants in Point Lisas that state or through its shareholdings and NGC equity has. But most of those are controlled by multinationals. And they also control a lot of the shipping and manage the shipping. So what we do control is small, but it has a big impact on our economy. So if NGC weren't able to load a cargo of LNG, for instance, or we had to shut the plants down because we couldn't do the LNG, then that'll be a big impact on the economy. So the question you're asking is anybody thinking about and planning for that? And I would hope so. I would hope that at some level there's a disaster management plan for the sector. There was one a few years ago, and it looks at the critical infrastructure, including the assets, the plants, pipelines, and facilities. And what would happen in case of some disaster, whether it were natural or man-made. And that will require some level of preparedness for such an incident, a level of response in case an incident would happen, and then some level of recovery after the fact. So, and there were identified back then agencies with key responsibilities to deal with that. There is an agency in place and a functional one under the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan. That deals with oil spills, which the potential in case of some kind of issues here, but it's not the only issue that might arise. So the place that something like this would arise normally in the first instance would be at the cabinet level. The Minister of Energy and the Minister for Infrastructure would probably have to think about this. And then, of course, the ODPM would have a role in this as well. But this is potentially a major disaster if the worst case scenario would arise.
Well, but the fishermen are the only ones who are talking about an impact simply because they are afraid.
Yeah,
they were afraid of getting on the wrong side of the Guardia Nacional, the Venezuelan, because they sense there is some hostility and they just feel that going out there at this time is not a good idea.
That's an interesting point because, prior to the Trinidad and Tobago Venezuela Maritime Boundary Treaty, signed earlier in the 1990s, there was a lot of hostility between the Guardia Nacional and the Trinidad fishermen. And in negotiating that treaty, a few things happened that mitigated that. And the Trinidad fishermen have had a lot less difficulty working in Venezuelan waters since then.
Yeah, it used to be a regular occurrence. Now it's occasional.
And
you're never quite sure if it's fish or something else in that particular incident.
Well, one byproduct is the fact that if you go down to Cedros, for example, the active trade with Venezuelan vessels coming in from the Orinoco region or the Delta Macuro to Cedros and areas like that, trade goods, charcoal for that has dropped considerably.
I imagine so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine so. It was a little surprising to me to hear the Prime Minister be shocked at the condition of the Cedros security facilities. I think she sent one of her ministers of national security to look at it, and I think he went 2 weeks ago. This is in light of the American presence. And he came back and said, it's a dump, not fit for human habitation, because that is a part of the country. It's South Trinidad, and it just tells me how disconnected that community is from representation politics in Trinidad and Tobago. I myself had the experience years ago, and I never tire of telling the story, of I was told to go and speak to a particular person. And when I went to the person's house, they told me, just hold on, she go on supermarket and she coming back. And lo and behold, the person eventually comes off a pirogue, having gone to do her groceries in Venezuela. One of Pedernales or one of those places, and everything that was coming off the boat was in Spanish. And that was normal. It showed that the relationship between Cedros and Venezuela was so intimate. There was never the thought of going to Point Fortin or La Brea or San Fernando. The orientation is as historic as the Waro people who were there in Cedros and crossing back and forth and being the same community. It wasn't a Trinidadian Waro and a Venezuelan. It was the Waro community that integrated those areas.
Yeah. Families on both sides, that is,
Yeah.
that is,
And it has been a neglected area, and by all, I think. It was so, CJOS was so, ICACA, so out of the frame of reference for the last government, for example, that when we boasted that we had locked down the country tight for COVID and you couldn't even come home if your parent died or something, there was a trade was going on up and down in the southern coastline. People were coming and going, and the Delta virus, which is the one that claimed the most lives, was actually identified as having come with an illegal immigrant on the southern coast, right? Because it didn't even occur to people that the back door was wide open, because you're so focused on what you think are your security points, the port in Port of Spain, Chaguaramas, airport most of all. And it's like it's another world. So this challenge of integrating the country, that's not going to be easy, because that history is so deep, and it's a totally different world.
Yeah, the towns of Pedernales, Tucupita, which are all in the Delta Amacuro, they historically have been tied to Trinidad, to the Cedros area, to all of those areas, and you can gauge the level of commerce now. It has dropped significantly. The level of immigration has dropped significantly.
Is that your speculation? When you these are known reports. Is it based on newspaper reports? I saw some reporting in the newspaper about the fish, but
no, not newspaper reports. There are people who keep track of that.
Okay,
that's all, right? And I'm privy to some of that. That's the point. But I think it, for Trinidad, it's a loss. If anything, if you want to take a global look at it, Sunity, we are not, as Trinidadians, replicating ourselves fast enough. We're just not. We need an infusion. Venezuela is providing some of that, and it should be encouraged. That's the point of view. Yeah. What are we? 1.4 million people for the last, God knows how long. Okay, we just not replicating fast enough.
Well, and you may have a point there, but if we are doing that, I would suggest that we do it in a structured fashion. We're kind of doing it in the way we do many things. We know it's happening, but we don't want to say it, and we just don't want to have to deal with it. So you come in if you can. We'll pretend that you're not here illegally, but no, you can't go to school. You can't send your children to school, and you're not supposed to use a health center or the health system. We don't put the arrangements to structure it, because it comes down to politics. In that, political parties are always afraid of the public's perception, because the public, half of them will say, no, we don't want any illegal immigrants. And then the other half will say, well, I actually want them, but I want them to stay illegal so I could give them a sub-minimum wage salary, and I could take away I could threaten them. And so there's a lot of exploitation that takes place because of that. And because of the contentious and conflicting interests, politicians just say, let me not deal with that. That's a hot potato. Let it go along and it will sort out itself, And I think that's what's been going on. Like we can't really say how many Venezuelans have come to Trinidad in this last wave, the wave that has been fueled since the embargo really started to bite. And,
my experience is a little different. I speak Spanish fluently. It's almost my first language. And I have a lot of Venezuelan friends, particularly in the Chaguanas area. All right? And there are many, many of them who don't intend to go back. Some intend to go back if the conditions improve in Venezuela, but most of them starting families, getting married, buying a house. Legal or illegal, I don't know. I don't ask to see any evidence that they're legal. But the point is, it's happening. It's happening. That integration is taking place, and it's taking place rather rapidly. And to me, as I say, it's a good sign because we need that infusion.
Well, I think when you see Venezuelans selling doubles, you know that they are they're into the fabric of the country, making doubles and selling it, and the art of how you wrap and how fast you do it, that you do it. It just tells you the integration is there, and I do think that Central Trinidad is a major catchment for right. Because they may come through the south or they may come through the airport, but there's a lot of they certainly have a lot of jobs, and that gives us skews because I don't know if it's recorded in the labor statistics, but it is one of the factors in any country that immigrant labor, especially illegal immigrants, keep the cost of labor low. And actually act as a deterrent in inflation.
Yeah, as I say, I move around a lot in Chaguanas because of friends, and that's the fastest growing city in the country. Construction upon construction, and Venezuelan labor is a good part of that. And as I say, it's something that we really should encourage rather than discourage.
Yeah, well, encouraging means bringing it into the system, right? In a legitimate fashion.
I think so. I think so. But there has to be political will to do that, and I don't think Trinidadians are strong on political will.
Well, I think we could try to wrap it at this point. Any closing?
Just on that question of migration, I've been working in different places, and some of them have very small populations with big oil and gas discoveries and huge potential for growth, and have big demands on local content, wanting work to be done by locals, but not having the people in numbers. And Suriname is an example, Guyana is an example, Namibia is an example.
Guyana is such a huge example.
And what I've been trying to advocate when I work with governments there is look at the countries who have small populations, who have big economic booms, like the United Arab Emirates, like Singapore. What do they have? Large immigrant populations. But they've had enlightened migration policies where they would allow people to come in, where they treat with them, the way they get services and the way they work, right? Now, if you can find a way to tap into that, that'll help the economy grow. Now, that works well if you have a growing economy, right? Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, our economy has stalled, but it doesn't mean there isn't headroom for growth, right? So I think Tony is right that, and everywhere we see it, migrants work hard and work well because the motivations they have. Right, so question is, again, who's thinking about it in Trinidad? Who's driving this? And it's not clear to see.
But why do you think that we're not thinking about it?
I don't see evidence of policies. I don't see evidence of activities.
But I want to offer speculate, right? And I think again comes back to the historic conditions of the divide and rule policies, colonial policies that have underpinned this modern society. And so the fear of the other is still so alive. We thought in Trinidad, when Guyana's oil sector just burst open and exploded, that we were a natural ally. Trinidad would be a natural ally. And we've heard from Trinidad businesses saying, no, the Guyanese are don't want Trinis there. And that had its origins in the treatment that Trinidadians and Trinidad immigration would give Guyanese in the years when they were very poor, and the exploitation that people would, impose upon young women who came to work here, and the treatment they'd get. And so now that they have, possibility of money, and no, we don't want you, or you all weren't nice to us. And then you have like a situation of Haiti, right? Where Haiti, so many people, a country with plenty people, plenty trouble. It should be a natural source of labor throughout the Caribbean, for countries that have a lot of land and the need to develop it and so on. Haiti has a long history of agrarian peasants and so on, but there are factors inside of that militate against even opening up and broaching the issue of immigration and allowing people to work. So if we do it under the radar and we pretend we don't see it, but to actually say to your country that we are, our population target, and our economic development plan requires so, we won't do that, because there are historic hostilities that would flare up and would say we're against that. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, are you asking then really about the future?
Yeah, what my fear is in this particular moment is how we might bungle our way into a problem that could have been avoided. Because it's not only this situation, but the thought out scenario, the plan, the consultation, and the kinds of things that you put in place for avoiding surprises, we just don't have it. And often the surprise is that it didn't happen. The bad thing didn't happen somewhere, and that's why this is what underpins this idea that God is a Trini. That we do so much that could throw us into trouble, and it doesn't happen. But I do know that not only in Trinidad, but other places in the Caribbean, when you least expect, and when you think everything is fine on the surface, you discover that a power vacuum has developed, and one day you wake up and there's an attempted coup, right? So there are undercurrents in the society that societies should have the capacity to see through the first and second and third layers to understand. I mean, this is what thinkers do. And leaders are thinkers, right?
Should be.
I remember. Sorry, I was going to say, Tony and I would know about this because we probably participated in many of these things, and that is where you begin to look at Trinidad and Tobago in 2030. Trinidad and Tobago in 2050. We used to do a lot of that forecasting. And in a public way, the best minds were called together to prepare so that we wouldn't have surprises. I don't know whether that still continues. I have no reason to think it is. But we used to think it out, and we used to prepare for it.
But I think the fact that is not happening is an indication of how the executive, the power has shifted powerfully to the executive, as opposed to the professional classes, the civil society organizations that used to be a counterweight to arbitrary power. And so everybody now is beholden to whoever is in office. There is no the counterweight to that has been eroded over time, but it is a space that needs to be occupied.
Yeah, let me put it this way: that let me go back to 1972, for example. Eric Williams called me to Trinidad. He wanted me to serve on the Constitution Commission that was being formed, and I said no, it was not my thing. So he told me, well, I'm forming a Caribbean task force. And what you guys will do is go out and plan Trinidad's foreign policy for the medium and the long term. Okay? And the penalty I paid for that was that I had to go to 6 Latin American countries in about 3 months. The essence of that is that I remember planning. We used to plan. I don't know whether we are still planning. Tony, do you know?
I don't see it. And
No.
I think
But you're leaving out an important piece there.
well, I think the point is Sunity was making but not saying is that we move from the counterbalance of civil society and other voices. We're moving towards an authoritarian kind of leadership. I mean, you're not using the word, but if you look at how people treat their leader, the prime minister, in the past and in recent times, it's almost as if, Eric Williams' words of no dog shall bark, when I say come, you come at, has come to pass, where there's not even within the hierarchy of the government, you get a sense there's a counterweight to the maximum leader. Maybe some, but you don't get the sense that that's a powerful voice.
But that incident that you recount, described there, Tony Bryan, what is notable is that it was 1972. Because when the oil embargo happened and Trinidad experienced a flush of sudden money, the same Dr. Williams famously said, planning has lost its mystique, and started to fall out with his economic advisors and so on, who were trying to plan for a new society based on a sudden infusion of money, put them into ISO and said, no, there's money. And the first thing he did, it came from a budget in 73 that had no money. And then the next one was the giveaway budget of all the subsidies and so on. Well, it was an opportunity for people who were coming through a very hard time, right? The post-independence period was one of declining, lower revenues. 73 was particularly hard, and then suddenly money. And planning has taken a backseat ever since, which is that the political requirements, and you're in this election cycle, you either just come out of election or you're planning for the next election, and the political imperatives are driving government expenditure and policy, right? Even policy, you're in a stage where you don't know what the policy is. It's not one government. Some pretend they're planning, but what they do is managing by VAPs and very often on headlines. So depending on who makes the most noise in the society, something might happen there. We will deal with that today. We will prioritize that. We will put something else in the back of the list. And so this, you're seeing it, Guyana is reliving our experience. And for the people, for the Trinis who feel that they're somehow superior and look at how we are managing our country, they forget what we were doing during the first oil boom. Just splurging, and everything was happening and at the same time, and the electricity generation couldn't cope, and the phone system, and Dr. Williams threatened to throw his phone in the Gulf of Paria because the system's infrastructure was collapsing. And it is what happens when you get that sudden money. But how do you find your way back? And what we are seeing, it is no surprise that what we are seeing is a centralization of power in the Prime Minister, because that constitutional framework exists. That is the constitutional framework we have. If you're in government, it is up to the person who is a Prime Minister to be a person who has a decentralized approach or centralized approach. There's nothing in law to say you have to be a certain way. But if you're in opposition, you have no power. All you have is a mic. You have your mouth. You could try to get people to protest, but you essentially have no power. And so that impulse to get into office just to have power, and it's only the Prime Minister who is important. No matter what, the ministers are disposable. Right? You might be in the office, but you might be a backbencher in office. So we still have all the same issues, and what comes up is events. Like this is an event right now. A Prime Minister is responding this way. that may work itself out, as so many things happen to us, but it could as easily backfire. Nobody knows really how this is going to go.
Quite true. Quite true. Just to reflect on our oil and gas development here, and the period in the 70s when things got better. Guyana is going to go through. I don't know, Tony, whether you agree with me or not, but it's going to go through that resource curse stage, the poverty of plenty, where demand is going to not meet expectations. It's going to have a rough time, and we have got to be circumspect about that. Do you agree?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Trinidad went through that multiple times, and in the last, with the big gas boom of the early this century, we didn't have the capacity to manage expenditure, to plan projects, to negotiate contracts, to manage contractors. We had a lot of waste and a lot of inefficiency. Other than waste, people were stealing money. There was. So I think unless Guyana, in parallel to spending the money in preparation for it, build capacity to manage the money well, around those things, they will get that. They will get a lot of wastage, and the money will go through quickly. And with all the results, like Trinidad, people always say Trinidad should be much better off given the amount of money that went through here. But building the capacity and managing the inflow. And at the moment, Guyana is making the decision, and that's their choice, to get the money as quickly as possible. Whether that's the right choice, both from a technical perspective, and in other words, how the reservoirs are managed, that's a different issue, but that has impact on how much revenue you ultimately get. So
I remember Michael Manley saying that the money in Trinidad was going through like a dose of salts.
Yeah, famously said that,
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of the technocrats who I know, very senior technocrats in Trinidad, at the time were against Atlantic Trade 4. For one reason, we knew we didn't have enough proven reserves to sustain the plans that we had in place with that, and we've proven that now. And we also knew that we didn't have the capacity in place to manage revenue coming in, and it will lead to a lot of corruption and bad expenditure. And we've seen that. So I think whereas Trinidad in the early days built some capacity to manage the sector, but had some policies and ways to run it well, and we invested a lot of that in some useful infrastructure and services.
But the energy sector in the Caribbean is like climate change. There are no borders, right? In energy terms, what happens with Caracas, with Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago? It's in one particular area. And therefore, that need for some kind of common interest, constant talking to each other, collaborative approach, you have no walls in the sea.
I just published actually a few weeks ago a paper on the Southern Caribbean Energy Matrix, which is to say Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, moving towards some sort of energy integration in the Southern Caribbean. I think that will come to pass. I detect, Tony, that in certain areas of Trinidad's maritime control, we have endless gas. And it's going to start coming on stream in 2027, 2028. This will provide another boom again. How we manage that is an open question. Am I correct in that assumption?
Well, I think we have a lot of gas, but I don't think 2027 is going to make any difference significantly. What will happen is that the decline we're seeing might be arrested a little bit. But there's no new reserves being added. All they're doing is going to produce existing reserves. Now, in my view, from my experience, there is more gas to be found, but nobody's going after that. The companies who are the major producers are in what they call harvest mode. They're not investing. They're just
but what is responsible for that? Is it that they are in between the energy configuration of fossil fuels and clean energy?
No. That's not bothering them. That's not impacting their behavior. That's just window dressing. They're going after oil and gas. What is happening is that they manage their global portfolio as a portfolio, and they decide where they invest when, where they harvest when. Nobody's managing Trinidad's portfolio. They have different investors, different assets, and the ministry, which is supposed to do that, is in free flow and has been in decline for a long time. So we are just going wherever the companies want to go, without saying, hang on, this is where the country should go. And that is why, for instance, we had Train 4 and no backup plan for the rest of the trains, and there's a plants that will be starved of gas.
Well, Tony, that's a good segue for me to say that you and I are going to be part of a series of discussions on the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and as it includes the rest of the region. And I think the motivation in that discussion is to have a better informed public and therefore more informed discussion on a sector that historically is an offshore. It doesn't create palpitations except when oil price high, oil price low. That's about all the average person wants to know. What is the government take? But in terms of an understanding of how this thing works, to have informed position and to be able to plan your business and your life. That is the series that we'll be doing here on Caribbean Newsroom. The other, Tony, I'd like to ask you to put to send me the link to your paper if it's published somewhere. And is it in a public space? Is it something open to the public, or is it a specialist?
I'll send it to you.
Right, and we'll put it we'll put it up online with this discussion.
I would like to participate in those energy discussions, actually.
All right, so we have a team. Yeah, good. The more voices, and if I were to end this conversation, I would ask you all to do it, but it is exactly that. We have to create an environment where people want to contribute to the public discussion and to amplify that, because ultimately our best safeguard against any scenario is an informed, enlightened public that has a shared understanding, not a divided position, but a shared understanding on the things that matter to their survival and their well-being and their future, right? So I would invite you all to have your closing comments at this stage.
I've said many times that, energy is such an important part of Trinidad and Tobago's life architecture. We should have everyone talking about energy, schools talking about energy. You breathe energy, you talk energy. But we haven't done that in any organized fashion. What you're doing here, I think, certainly is a step forward, and I can only hope that it blossoms as time goes on.
Do you want to say something about the whole discussion we're having about the current moment? Some few words on that.
The current moment, I think we're between a rock and a hard place. All right, we have to recognize one thing. It's almost international relations 101, and that is countries don't have friends; they have interests. All right, and the point is that all we have seen demonstrated so far is some idea of friendship. Friendship with the United States, friendship with this, that, and the other. No, boil it down to interests. What is in our interest to have a relationship? That should be our operating principle.
There's a couple of points you both raised, and hopefully things that we can discuss later on in the series you mentioned earlier. One, for instance, Tony just said it, there isn't a discussion about the sector generally, and there's not an understanding of it. And in places I've worked in several places in Africa and Guyana and Suriname, there's a lot of active civil society bodies, not just individuals, civil society organizations, who are sometimes well funded and who get engaged in the discussion and want to carry the message to their communities wherever they are. But there's also a very engaged and informed and curious media who want to tell stories, who want to understand, who want to learn. And in Trinidad, those two are missing at this moment. You don't have strong, at least I don't see them, civil society involved in the sector. I mean, the other point I want to raise is one that you spoke about. People aren't affected by the oil and gas sector. That's not true. South of the Central Range, right? People in those communities are very affected. We've killed communities by shutting down operations in oil and gas activities. We've killed the service companies who hired people, who built subsidiary businesses around them, who built communities, support communities. Many of them have died, right? So, but we don't see that from Port of Spain or from areas around on the north. A lot of people are suffering in those areas because we've stopped activities in the oil fields, right? And why is that? Is it there's no oil, more oil in the ground? There is more oil in the ground. Are we going after it? Are we taking it out? No. Who's driving that? And back again, who's managing our portfolio? And that's not happening. And the last point I want to close on is the point Tony is about the Southern Caribbean collaboration. Again, who's driving that?
Yeah, wasn't
Who's
there the
thinking it through?
Southeast Consortium, some Southeast Caribbean Consortium at some decades ago that was developed with this in mind? SECC? What
No.
was
So
that?
so that's a group of companies working in some oil fields.
Okay, all right, okay.
So Tony's talking about Suriname, Guyana,
Yeah,
Trinidad
yeah, I know,
collaboration, right? And I think there are ways to
Oh
do
yeah,
that,
these are new players. So
right? But I don't think the discussion is being done dispassionately and from an equity perspective. I think from what I've seen over the last few years, Trinidad wants to sell things to Guyana and Suriname and bring gas to Trinidad. And Trinidad has been saying, how can we help you develop what you have in situ? You know, it's about Trinidad's own interest rather than Guyana's interest or Suriname's interest. And that is why people are not buying it, because why are you different from the guys from North America or Europe who are coming here? You're not showing me any compassion, understanding what I need, and telling me you'll help us. The Ghanaians are going to Guyana and Suriname and doing that. The Nigerians are going there and doing that. And the Namibians visited Guyana to see how they're doing their oil development. So Trinidad has lost its place as a focal point. People wanting to learn about oil and gas. Because we're not demonstrating, we want to share what we've learned.
Yeah,
That's a worry.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tony. I remember the days when Ghana would send a delegation to study our Point Lisas, you know, and the LNG arrangements there. I don't see any visits anymore.
well, I remember that book that was produced with Trevor Ace's book, and there's a chapter on the Trinidad experience, right? This is the thing that African countries were coming because it was a global model for tapping into the value add for the benefit of your country and not just being raw producers. You bring up the raw material and you get royalties and taxes and that's it. How do you keep more of the value for your country? And we did that with the downstream sector.
Yep.
And became a global model and people wanted to know how. And but the historical forces, the divisions in the Caribbean, that we have not reached where Tony is talking about. He says in the future he sees these 4 countries, that we have not even instinctively seen that is obvious because we're still fighting. One is Spanish, 2 were Dutch and English, and then Trinidad, right? So I would so I'm looking forward to that series, and I would close by saying that in every situation, the bulwark and the anchor of a society is its people. And when its people surrender, they're not only their right to speak, but their responsibility to speak, and to speak from a position of knowledge. And they hand that over to somebody else, then the consequences become obvious. No one person can carry that for you. And what is your interest that is so coincident with some other person's interest that you could hand over everything without even a negotiation? The issue of interest, I think, is paramount because there are layers of interest. There's individual interest, there's family interest, there's professional interest, there's sectoral interest. But all of them ought to be secondary to national interest. And national interest can only be valid if it meets people's interest as well. You have to negotiate all of these interests. You can't say it's not government interest. We can't confuse government and state. Right? Those are two things. What is the national interest? And the national interest that we have as a people is to keep the society together, because you can never govern with half the country. And everybody comes into office saying, I might have been voted in by a group, but I represent everybody in this country. So you have to work at representation. And if people in representative politics do not play their part, then who do you blame? You can't blame it. Governments don't elect themselves. People elect them. And so the responsibility for especially the professional class and the private sector to inform themselves, to have the courage and the confidence. That's the other thing. People feel if they speak something, their head will get cut off. And so that's not true. Trinidad is still a place where you can speak. It is a fear of fear that will keep you back. And if people sense that about you, it's like an animal, they sense fear. They don't even have to bite you. And you're terrorized. No, you check, the check and balance is public opinion in a democracy. It's public opinion. And I think that to the extent that we see that is lacking, especially with the energy sector, and I don't think I said the communities weren't affected. I said people don't feel that what's going on in the energy sector is directly to them. It's an offshore, and it was started by foreigners. They're running the thing. Just give us the money. There's no way to treat the engine of growth in your society. That's your business. And we see other countries where tourism is a big thing. They're going out there with a smile every day, and they hide in crime. And they're doing it not because the government telling them to do it. They know their bread and butter is tied to tourism, and they understand that. But I don't think that we understand how the energy sector is our bread and butter. And therefore, we have not played a full role in it. So I want to thank both of you for being here with us today and for opening the bowling on this particular issue. Hopefully, I am hoping that we don't have to revisit the geopolitical situation too rapidly with a hastening regularity, and that it is that Tony is right and that I'm wrong, and that it's grandstanding. And then if the conversation changes in the States and we hear less of all the burdensome issues that trouble the President of the United States, like the Epstein factor and so on, that maybe it will dissipate, and that the conversation that we have not had about this here at home, that we have the chance to find a way of how to deal with these things in future. So thank you. See you next time.